On behalf of the Professional Baseball Strength and Conditioning Coaches Society, I'd like to welcome you to the PBSCCS Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Messina.
How about a push-pull ratio for overhead athletes? I mean, athletes in general, I feel like it's always been said that you should have X amount of pushing versus pulling. And do you guys feel that there is a specific ratio? Do you not care at all when you program? Like, let's talk about that for a little bit here.
I don't really care right now. I used to maybe have it internally. I want to have X amount more exercises pulling than pushing, but again, I'm not sure where that stems from, and again, where the evidence kind of lies that created that belief in the first place that that's commonly become accepted at this point. But I mean, I end up training pretty balanced regardless. But you could say that that's not exclusive to the upper body. Like if I'm doing lower body training, like I tend to do an equal amount of knee versus hip dominant, or again, quad versus hamstring intensive work. I'm not trying to follow a ratio or a formula there. It just intuitively makes sense of training a little bit of everything over the course of a week or a day. And the upper body is really no different. And anytime I've tried to have a ratio, you realize that, well, shoot, like say I'm trying to, again, do a horizontal press because it's the time of the year where I want to be increasing strength here. And I did 5 sets. Then all of a sudden, like, well, shoot, like I'm looking at, say it's a 2-to-1 ratio. Like I'm going to spend all this time just pulling on stuff to make up this ratio. And you do more than one pressing exercise in a day or in a week. And all of a sudden you're just spending all this time just throwing in more and more. Well, I have to keep pulling on things in order to keep my ratio intact. And it just gets out of hand. So it ends up probably being pretty balanced for us. Like I'm not consciously trying to skew it and pushing, pulling, front of the body, back of the body, anything like that. It's just that's kind of how I'm writing programs regardless, is pretty balanced throughout to train every motion and every part of the musculature.
Great. 2-to-1. Where the hell did it even come from? Like, that's what in my mind, I've been ingrained throughout, like, growing up through college and being a college baseball player and stuff. It's like, you should always have, twice as many pulls as you have pushes. But again, where the hell did that even come from? So I kind of fall on that same thought process as like, balance works, right? Obviously, we have to consider too what the, from our programming perspective, like if we're programming in twice as many pulls as we are pushes, like what about like the athletic training staff and what they're doing to our athletes? Particularly pitchers in this instance, but what are they doing to the pitchers post throw? They're going through a whole shoulder program, a whole scap retraction type program, everything like that. They're getting extra work in that area as well. So if we're programming in that kind of like, again, go back to my example, like that 2-to-1 ratio, they're probably getting more like 3, maybe even 4-to-1 ratio. So do we become super imbalanced from that perspective? So I think my thought process on that has changed over the years as well. Again, like it's hard to shake something that you've been like so ingrained in. Again, going back to the whole bench press scenario, like we shouldn't bench press. When I was in college and I was a college pitcher, like I never bench press because all you read is like pitchers shouldn't bench press and baseball players shouldn't bench press. But more of that stuff is kind of going by the wayside as more, we're becoming more educated, and I think the push to pull ratio kind of probably falls in that as well. And I'm not like, I don't dig super deep into research all that much. I'm not like, scalping the internet looking for research articles every day, but I haven't seen a ton of stuff that actually proves that like 2-to-1 is better than 1-to-1. So I think probably a balanced approach is better. And again, it's going to go back to case by case with each individual athlete. But I've always had this 2-to-1, 2-to-1 push to pull ratio kind of programmed in my mind. But I don't necessarily see the benefits in that.
I usually sit pretty balanced. I mean, some of the factors that you would consider might be, time dependent. Are you in a season? Are you out of season? What's your throwing volume? What's your, like Joe mentioned, what's your athletic training volume look like if they're going through shoulder care or whatever with the ATs and PTs? Do they have, I know with the Pirates, there was some routines, that the band routines that they would go through from the pitching side. So, all of those things, are pieces that should be taken into account. Their load that's placed on the athlete, and you should at least understand that. But I think that the push to pull ratio is probably, if you're getting into that minutia as you're writing the program and like measuring out, my 1.2 to 1 or whatever, you're probably a little ways down the rabbit hole. And I would argue that there's some lower hanging fruit you could probably make an impact on.
I didn't even think about the band work, all these pitchers doing J band work prior to they throw anyways, which is like 90% dominant on pull type and retraction type exercises. Like, you're getting a fair amount of that anyways. Maybe that's something that's changed over the years too. Who knows? Like, as this field has kind of evolved, and as maybe like physical player development has evolved, like maybe that needs to change a little bit more, just because there's more emphasis on that stuff in other domains kind of outside of the strength and conditioning realm.
So when I was in college, I was the same way, Joe. It was like 2 to 1, maybe even 3 to 1 if you can find time for it in your program. And I was like beating myself up, like, man, I really want to press right here in the program, but 2 to 1, 3 to 1. And then I saw something on the internet, or somebody told me, and they're like, hey, if 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 really worked, like, wouldn't rock climbers have perfect shoulders and posture because they're pulling all the time? And if you look up pictures of them, they're all like hunched forward. They all have shoulder problems. Like, so I was like, okay, maybe I've been thinking about this wrong. And now I'm with you guys. I'm pretty balanced with my pushing, pulling, and then understanding all the other stuff that goes in on the baseball side, the AT side. And then the other thing that like we think about is it's been so posterior dominant, to the point where now a lot of like hitting coaches that I've listened to like talking, they're like, we forget about like the anterior side. Like, there's so much value in that front side and being able to stabilize on that front side. And like, everybody is so braced and so backside dominant now that like they can't move through their core, through their spine. So it's just something to think about. And I think it goes back to something Jordan was talking about earlier. It's just like, you don't just do something because it's always been that way. Like, you have to look through your programs, you have to understand things, and like you have to look at current research and really question everything. Like, question all of the things that you've been taught in the past by others that like Joe said, we're continuing to learn and get better, and there are better ways to do things. And I don't know, the ratio thing always, like, after I went through the rock climbing phase, I was like, maybe everything is wrong with what I do. And then it was, you start questioning everything you do. But yeah, it was just, I don't know. I don't know where that ratio actually came from. And like beating myself up over the programming details of that, like really like had sleepless nights because of that. And now I'm like, why was I so concerned with that?
It's funny you say that, because actually last week I watched the documentary, the Free Solo documentary on the guy that climbed El Capitan there. And that was one of the things that went through my head while I watched it, was like, posturally, you would expect him to be looking a little bit better than he does, but like, every sport has its postural adaptations, but he has a rock climber's looking body in it, really, for all the hanging and climbing and pulling that he does. Like, doesn't look like what you'd expect it to in my mind. So it's funny that you brought that up, because it literally, like, I think last Thursday I watched that movie and was going through that.
Yeah, I think there's two things that I pulled from that too. Like, one, when you find adaptations in people, or what would commonly potentially be considered like a maladaptation, is that something you need to address? Do you need to balance it and make sure it doesn't get worse? Do you need to try to fix it? is that the reason that they're good at what they do? You know, like, did they adapt that way because that's what allows them to have success? You know, and then I think the other piece that Chris mentions on the research side, you know, it's like you can read research, and I think that's very important. You need to know what the current research is and trends that are becoming available. And the other thing to look at, though, is, you know, who is this study done on? Does it work in mice? You know, if a study comes out next week that says, you know, we did a study and you should never bench press because it caused these bad, you know, adaptations, we had all these injuries, whatever. And in my scenario, I'm bench pressing guys and having great success. You don't just dump it and be like, oh, I read one research article that said it was terrible, right? Like, you got to apply those things to your scenario slowly over time and see how that research might affect your population. But the chances of, you know, Chris reading a research article that was done on major league pitchers between the ages of 28 and 34, you know, in the current era is like zero, right? It was probably done on a different sporting populations, potentially a different level of, there's so many different variables. And even if it was, it's in a different organization that had different guidelines and had different issues that they were dealing with. So, you know, it informs your decisions, but it doesn't make your decisions for you.
A lot of research is done in controlled settings, which we know is baseball is not by any stretch of the imagination a controlled setting ever.
I mean, when are you ever going to have a controlled setting? Move outside of baseball. It just never happens.
Yeah, just the lab. That's it. Yeah, the next question I have for you guys is kind of in regards to like shoulder care and shoulder programs for guys. Like, do you think upper body training is enough to have a quote unquote shoulder care program, or should athletes be doing separate routines focused on those, you know, the smaller muscles and things like that?
Yeah, I like the idea of shoulder care and doing exercises that are, you know, potentially based around some smaller musculature training and endurance within the scapula and rotators. Does a lot of that get done through throwing? Like, are you know, it's one of those saying, the best way to get better at squatting is to squat, right? So the best way to get your shoulder better for, you know, to endure throwing is to run a progression that builds up your throwing. Do the exercises you're doing in the weight room provide you with stimulus on those rotators and on scapular strength and on, you know, all the things that you're looking for out of that program? Absolutely. Does it necessarily check the box entirely, or you need some more on top? Sure. The big thing that sticks out to me though is separate, right? Like if you have your ATs or PTs running a shoulder care program, right, and you're running a lift, they are separate. Now, if your ATs and PTs still run that shoulder care program, but it is now part of lift and you've included correctives within, or the correctives that you and your performance team deem necessary within the lift, is it still separate or is it together now because it's in the lift, right? It's not, they're exercises is all you're doing. You do them at a separate time and all of a sudden it's a separate thing. If you just included them in your training, is it still separate, or is it now not separate, or does it have to be done in the normal exercises that you were programming within your lifts? I mean, I think it's, you're just deciding on whether or not you need extra work done on certain areas within that athlete's body, but it could just as easily be merged into a lift as not, if you felt it was necessary for your athletes.
Yeah, I think it depends on your setting. So like, you know, we all have that kind of professional baseball lens where, you know, we have the ability to communicate and collaborate with our athletic training staff to figure out, you know, how to make a complete program for shoulder care and arm health and things like that. And so like, we tend to probably speak on that mostly, but, you know, in the college setting, maybe there's not as much of a communication there. And then in like the youth and high school setting, probably not. So I think it depends on your setting. I would say most likely probably for like your youth and high school athlete, yeah, you probably need to do something in addition to, if you're a baseball athlete, in addition to probably your training that kind of supplements, and follows a scheme around when you're throwing and things like that. But again, it all really depends. Like I would say that probably every organization has some sort of collaboration between like what happens in the weight room, what happens in the training room when it comes to arm care, shoulder health, and stuff like that. Some probably better than others, but there's still something going on there to where like each discipline is kind of addressing what's going on. And the more communication and collaboration there is, probably the more individualized and specific that is to each player, that kind of rolls through the weight room. But maybe in the high school setting, high school youth stuff, probably most likely not as much. So I would say in that setting, there probably needs to be a little bit more, maybe an emphasis directly on shoulder care outside of what you do in the weight room. And let's be honest too, as a high school athlete, like you're probably rolling in and just trying to hit your major lifts and get stronger. Cause like, frankly, that's what you need for 90% of the athlete, that population. So, there's probably more of a focus on your major lifts and stuff like that, and probably less of an emphasis on shoulder care and arm health and stuff like that. So I think it just depends.
We'll still do shoulder arm care dedicated exercises. Been doing it for a while, but I just probably don't place as much emphasis or stock in them as I used to. Maybe they train some things that, again, some of our more traditional exercises don't, or some range of motion or capacities, but I don't see a downside to doing them. We just don't place quite as much of an emphasis as maybe we used to, but we'll still do them.
I think one benefit too, typically you're considering those exercises are probably using lighter loads than a lot of the things you would standard do in the weight room, right? It allows you to put athletes in different positions that you wouldn't be able to under higher loads. Again, I think that you can absolutely work those into your training session, right? They could easily be correctives that are programmed into your session. I think the other thing, and I don't want to open a whole can of worms or anything like that, but there's a lot of people using plyo balls at this point too. Some of that is with ATPT, some of that is with pitching staff. And again, that's falls in the same category to me of arm care, where, you could be doing it for arm care, you could be doing it to gain velocity. There's a lot of different options within that, but that's another variable that can also be considered within the arm care process. So now you're looking at potentially things within lift that are addressing that, things with ATs and PTs that are addressing that, things with the pitching staff that are addressing that. So I think, just like Joe mentioned, one of the biggest pieces is the collaboration part. If everybody knows what everybody's doing, the goal they're trying to accomplish, and how they're going about it, you're able to write a more cohesive, well-rounded program throughout all three departments that leads to the best result for the athlete.
You opened it. You opened that can.
Yeah, I thought that was the point of this episode, was just to open all the cans.
I saw one, I had to open it. So
No, it's a good point too. I mean, we could dive down that rabbit hole, for multiple other podcasts, but yeah, no, that's a very good point.
How about forearm, elbow, like bicep, tricep type stuff, in addition to the other upper body stuff we've been talking about? Do you guys put stock in that or no?
We've done way more arms this off season than we've ever done before, intentionally. Now we try to fit that in based on what time of the year and how much throwing they're doing. But we've got a time where they're just throwing at a maintenance level just to keep things loose. We started getting into some more, like, again, incline type angle curls, where again, we're getting biceps length on both elbow extension and shoulder extension at the same time. Thinking about, again, if we want to try to build some tolerance and some capacity, like, let's take it to longer lengths and get some tension at those long lengths. And that's no different than what we do for maybe a hamstring with, RDLs or Nordic emphasized exercises for, again, some lower body building. And for the upper body, again, with the bicep cross and the shoulder up there. And again, having shoulder emphasis and elbow as well. We'll try to train some of those ranges of motion that your traditional, rowing, pulling, pressing this, like you don't get into. But we're careful that when we do that, like we're giving someone new range of motion. We're not doing that in January while they're ramping up to get off a mound. Like that's October, November when we're in maintenance level throwing, and we've got some more volume available to train in the weight room. So in that regard, like we've done a ton more like direct bicep, tricep work this off season than in the past. And the forearm's kind of the same way. It's important. It's going to get stressed when you throw. So more than anything else, it's kind of off season. We'll hammer it more, but when they start to build up throwing, like you only get probably so much forearm stress that you could tolerate at any given time. And when throwing starts to take up a large portion of that, like the hay's in the barn at that point from what we did in the off season. So we'll back off from that during the season. But again, October, November, like there's a time where we're really pushing both of those things.
Yeah, no, I think I'm pretty much in the same boat there. I mean, if you need it, do it. If you don't. I think I would side with Jordan. There's probably a time of year where you're going to accentuate that more, and then there's a time of year where you're not. It does depend on your volume on the field and how much load you're placing on those tissues in other scenarios that, at certain times of year are going to be more important than what you're doing in the weight room, but you want to build those capacities to withstand it as you do get in season. So, you just got to make sure that it's addressed within your training in some way if it's a capacity the athlete needs to have as they move forward through the season.
Yeah, I think that for me falls into the same thing that I just mentioned, is like kind of depends on like what your situation is, like who handles that type of stuff, like where does the emphasis fall? Like, is that something that is more collaborative with the athletic training staff? Is that, which in the professional setting, maybe there's more of that direct forearm elbow work on a regular basis. My mind tends to just kind of bias towards the pitchers more, but that stuff is probably handled more from the athletic training side. But I think it depends on what your setting is and where you're at.
I think you'd be hard pressed to find a guy that isn't like super jacked up about arm farm. And like, so for me, I'm interested to hear specifically, Jordan, what you're talking about. You did more this off season. Like, how are you keeping guys in line so that they're not just going out like all out? You're like, hey, we're going to do more arms than we have, but I need you to keep it controlled. Like, are you checking tempos? Are you like limiting reps? Like, what are you doing to almost like pull those reins back? Or are you just letting them go, knowing that time of year they kind of aren't throwing that much anyways?
Yeah, we picked exercises that are probably non-traditional for what they're used to doing. So, these guys are at home, they're going to grab dumbbells and they're curl it. They're going to grab a bar and they're curl it. But probably not too many of them are going to like set up the cable machine in a way that puts you into some shoulder extension and elbow extension at the same time for like kind of an incline curl. So we're almost like creating these exercises that they haven't really done before. And we're teaching it and coaching it in a way that's like, hey, like we're paying attention to the detail on this versus, again, just going and broing out with it. But you will have to rein guys in and you just got to stay on top of it. One of the big reasons we're doing is like, again, we want that full lengthening across two joints there. So like you do have to coach it and make sure that guys are actually extending their elbow all the way, that they're standing in a place that their shoulder is extended the amount that we want. And sometimes depending on, again, the group that we've got and their maturity level, like we'll put a hard cap on like, hey, we're not dialing the Kaiser above whatever PSI, because none of you guys are strong enough to like actually use the range of motion with that amount of weight that we're looking for. So yeah, we actually have to coach it. It's not just to turn them loose, but most of the time we're picking exercises that are arm exercises that they haven't defaulted to in the past. So it's so new to them that they're having to learn how to do it. And as part of that, we control it very tightly. So I'm not usually throwing in like your standard barbell, dumbbell, curl, etc. Like we're doing some overhead tricep where we're trying to get, again, stretch across two joints there of the tricep, or more shoulder extended bicep stuff. And most of these guys, unless they're really far down the meat stick rabbit hole of, having all the bodybuilder exercises at their disposal, they probably have just never even thought of it before. But yeah, if you give a guy like dumbbell hammer curls, like they're going to just grab the heaviest thing and try to go to town. But you give them something that's a little more nuanced, and most of them have done a pretty good job of, again, paying attention to what we're actually trying to get from the exercise and not just throwing as much weight on there as they can.
You gotta give them credit. Like when buys and tries come out, guys will have the craziest angles and exercise. Like, where did you learn that from? So don't discredit them. But on a more serious note, it sounds like obviously you're not going for muscle mass strength type of deal. It's more of like a controlled range of motion. Here's a new exercise that you're not used to. You're not going to be able to overload this. Like, we're looking for very specific things versus like just trying to load on muscle mass for the sake of having, absolute hammer cannon arms.
Yeah, the hammer cannon arms are the byproduct of, again, some of the other stuff. But and most of the guys are going to get most of that from just pulling and rowing and doing chin-ups or, pressing heavier things in compound lifts with where they're at in their training careers. But it's a nice byproduct if you could get it.
You probably don't go too much with buy-in in the off-season programs if there's a lot more arms in there.
I mean, it's the psychological component too, right? And Jordan hit on that earlier, right? Like you give a guy, psychologically that, hey man, we want you to do some arms in the program here and be all in for that.
I love the K-box in the off-season, like in that October, November time period where we're pushing upper body volume more because we're not throwing. We use K-box curls a lot to try to get that, again, accentuated eccentric work and maybe some good tissue robustness as a result of that. Now, I'm not throwing that in the middle of July between starts, but we will do it the right time of the year.
K-box, super underappreciated tool right now. Super, super underappreciated. Okay, my last one for you guys. We've been talking about a whole bunch of exercises and things for the upper body. Is there anything that you would not recommend for overhead athletes, like regardless of time of year, range of motion, comfort level, all the stuff that we've already talked about? Is there any exercise that you're absolutely against for the overhead athlete, specifically the baseball player?
No, not really.
Philosophies over modalities for me. So if your philosophy states that you need to solve a certain problem for an athlete and an exercise fits that problem, then use it. But I don't think you can say an exercise is bad unilaterally.
I agree. I don't think there's any bad exercises. I just think there's maybe bad implementation exercises for the wrong people. So it's hard to say that there's a bad exercise for somebody.
Okay, before we sign off here, any closing thoughts, anything that we might have missed on the, deep down in the upper body training rabbit hole, or are we just going to sign this one off?
I mean, if the audience out there, again, if nothing else, if we can just stop planting the seeds that things are bad, like whether or not you want to use it or not personally, like that's up to you. There's a lot of things that's going to work, whether that's bilateral, unilateral, lower body stuff, or exercise selection, whatever it is. Like do what fits your situation and what you want to do. But we can avoid maybe planting the negative seed on things that you're not using that end up kind of tainting those for people that might want to use them in the future. Whether, again, you're a high school strength coach and you like to front squat and you don't back squat, like, cool, that's great. But if we can avoid saying that you're not back squatting because it's dangerous for X, Y, Z reason, just, again, to use that as an example, like, again, do what you want and do what fits your philosophy. But if we can all just collectively not taint exercises, it makes everyone else who comes along later in a guy's career, makes our jobs a lot easier if we do want to use those things.
Well said. I agree.
Logan, anything?
I'm all good, man.
All right, guys, I appreciate you coming on and beating this one down with me. And I think there was a lot of really good information. My notes sheet is just filled with stuff, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, everybody, that's going to conclude part 2 of this 2-part episode with Joe, Logan, and Jordan. I hope you enjoyed this one. To be honest, I hope you enjoyed both parts. I thought both were really informative. Ton of good information in both. This is a really big topic to try to cover, but I think we did a good job. I think we covered a lot of things. So I hope you enjoyed both parts. 3 things that I took from the guys in this particular episode: keep your training relatively balanced. Understand the athlete's volume as a whole and not just the volume that we as strength coaches are prescribing. And research should help inform your decisions, but it should not make the decisions for you. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll talk to you again on the next one.